Well, good morning and welcome to Unity of Buffalo. And I want to say also, happy Pentecost Sunday. It's not something we spend a lot of time on in Unity, but it's one of the stories I want to share with you today. And some of us, I guess, got the memo about wearing a little bit of red in our Pentecost Sunday and the fire. But this story goes in the book of Acts that a couple thousand years ago, Jesus' first disciples and followers, I think there were many others in the upper room, including women followers, and the Holy Spirit descended upon them. In chapter 2, verse 1-2, when the day of the Pentecost arrived, they were all together in one place. And suddenly there came from heaven a sound like a mighty rushing wind, and it filled the whole house where they were sitting. You know, we could say it was like a time when God broke through and made something new and miraculous. But today's lesson, let go of the story, on the one hand, can be kind of a playful way to, being playful helps us let go sometimes. But also, I think that one of the most important things that helps us to let go of stories that need to be released are to realize that every story is really a lesser story seeking to become a greater story. And here we had the followers of Jesus who were very discouraged and all hope was lost and things didn't go the way we thought they were going to go, and they gathered together, and a lesser story became a greater story. They had an experience of the Holy Spirit in their midst. And we might say it set them on fire to go forward and share a message. But metaphysically, we think of the Pentecost as the gathering of our spiritual powers for the purpose of harvesting the fruit of Spirit. You know, and I like to think that we do that all the time, gathering of our spiritual powers. We're doing that right now. Every time we come together as a spiritual community, we're gathering together to be reminded of the spiritual power within us. When you meditate or when you pray, you're gathering, you're focusing, setting aside the outside distractions, gathering, what are the spiritual powers within me? What's my superpower? And how do I gather that for the purpose of harvesting a greater experience? So, stories, you know, and I've had so many stories running through my mind and thinking about it, and then I open the Daily Word today, and there's Moses right there on the page. He says, you know, we're reminded of that story that Moses is having a conversation with God, and you might say he's being called up for service. God says, I need you. Go and lead the people. And, of course, what was his response? Not me. No, I stutter, I stammer. You got the wrong, can't you find somebody else? You know, this isn't mine to do. There must be somebody else. And, you know, God says, and then he says, well, who should I say sent me? And God says, well, I am that I am, that he discovers the presence of God right in the midst. And so he goes from a lesser story, thinking, I can't do it, it's not, you got the wrong person here, to stepping into a greater story. I feel like that happens a lot in our lives. You know, since Mother's Day, I invited people last week to reflect on stories about their mother. And I've had this one story that's just been kind of running through my mind a lot. And Eckhart Tolle mentions that in the book our spirit groups are studying, A New Earth, that sometimes a story just takes hold of us, you know, and we think about it, and it just runs through our mind. And sometimes it's an empowering story, and sometimes it's not so much. But this is a story about my mother that is such a source of inspiration for me. But I remember a time when I was only like 5 or 6 years old, and she wanted to buy some property, buy a cottage up north, northern Michigan. And she was being denied the opportunity to buy that property because you had to become a member of this association. And somebody, I think, had said something that was disparaging, and she got turned down for membership and was shocked. And this was something that was really important to her, that she really, really wanted. She had worked hard as a nurse to put together some money to buy a little cottage up there, and she just was not going to take this. And she said, I remember our family, me and my mom and dad, we hopped in the car in Detroit, drove 5 hours up north so that she could meet with the board of this association and say, there's a wrong here that needs to be righted. I deserve to be here. And I remember when she got in the car, she said, I've got too much Irish in me to let this go. And she went up and met with this board, I guess, or the powers that be, or whoever it was, and they reversed the decision and approved our family for membership. And really, the lesser story was accepting the rejection. And the greater story was saying, I'm going to confront this. I'm going to deal with this. And honestly, people that knew her thought of her probably generally as a very quiet, timid, kind of reserved kind of person. And she was transformed because there was something that she felt strongly about, that she really wanted, that she became a strong, confident woman who could stand up for herself and speak to whatever it was, were the powers that be there. I thought, oh, that's the memory I want to remember of my mom, as a strong, confident person who could stand up for herself, could speak up when she thinks there's a wrong that needs to be righted. A lesser story gave way to a greater story. So I'm hoping that sharing a few of these stories is kind of going to draw something out of you, that it's not me telling you a story, but there's a story in you that you're being called to step into. And metaphysics, well, we know Moses, literally his name means birth, drawing out from the water. So metaphysically, as a character in the Bible, he represents the drawing out of wisdom within us, drawing out of our powers, our spiritual powers, all those things you mentioned, understanding and faith and patience and courage and confidence, and we know all of them, and that, to me, that's how all change really happens, from the inner outward, involution to evolution. It doesn't happen from the out in, I'm going to make you different. Something within you gets stirred in some way, and you're like, oh, there's something, I've got some abilities here that I didn't know that I had. And so I could ask you, what else do you know about Moses? Well, he's the central figure in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Scriptures, just like Jesus is for the Christian Scriptures. We know he did a lot of things. He led the Israelites out of bondage into freedom, right up to the Promised Land. And he didn't get to go in. He received the 10 Commandments. A lot of things happened. But there were 3 phases to his life, each 40 years out of his 120-year life. So maybe some of us will go 120 years. But, each of those phases, the first really corresponds to what we're thinking of as the 4 pillars of integral ministry that I've been talking about a lot, that this is our own spiritual evolution. Wake up, grow up, clean up, and show up. The wake up is, and that was Moses' initial period of intellectual and mental development, understanding, learning about God, learning about life, learning about himself. But there's a distinction between intellectual and experience. And so the second phase of Moses' period of development was his spiritual development, where he had a deeper experience, where he was changed at depth, where he had the burning bush experience. And then the last third phase was show up, wilderness and transition and leading the people to the promised land. So that to me is the show up. So today's lesson about letting go of the story or learning to flap your wings, to me, is the grow up and the clean up. You know, that sometimes there's some things we need to release, some things we need to let go of, some old stories that don't serve us anymore. But, you know, stories are really powerful. They join the past to the future. Stories affect people to the core of their beings. You know, I think everybody loves a good story, or, you know, a movie or a play or a book, or, you know, that they always say, you know, out of a Sunday lesson, people remember the stories more than the points. You know, I could give you a really great quote or 3 bullet points, but it'll probably be, later in the day, it'll be a few of the stories that I share that make the greatest difference. And Eckhart Tolle says in his book that the past lives in you as memories. But memories themselves are not a problem. It's good that I'm glad I remember the story about my mother. But it's when we learn, you know, we learn from the past. We get inspiration, we get inspired. But it's when the memories or thoughts, when they take you over completely, that they can turn into a burden. So stories are a good thing, you know, and I've found sometimes the best stories are stories that that somehow connect us with our roots, or in some way take us home, whatever home is for us. It might be going back to a place where we grew up, but it might be home within ourselves. It might be finding the divine presence within us, you know, finding a place that feels like home. So I had another story, a story about a story. This is a real story that happened. I was driving. Well, first of all, you have to know that there's this tiny little town. I was going to try to find a picture on a map and put it up there, but it's called Mineral Wells, Texas. Has anybody ever heard of it? Oh, Judy has. It's a tiny little town about an hour and a half west of Fort Worth. And of course, in its heyday, a lot of people came for the mineral water and the wells, and it had a heyday, but believe me, it's kind of way past its heyday now. But one of my best friends from college grew up there. She was high school valedictorian and came on to college, and I met her. So I've been back to see her there several times. But I've never, in all my years, run into anybody else who even heard of mineral wells. But I was driving up Delaware Avenue, not too far from here, a couple of years ago, and suddenly I realized there was a car right in front of me that had a bumper sticker on it that said, Mineral Wells, Texas. I was like, oh my God. But it was a New York State plate, and so I started following the car. I thought, I got to catch up with this guy, you know. I followed, he stopped at a light, I stopped, and then he turned into Forest Lawn Cemetery. So I turned into Forest Lawn Cemetery. And he stopped at 1 or 2 places, and then he kept going. So I waited till he stopped, and then I pulled up right behind him, and I thought, oh my God, he's going to think I'm stalking him or something. But I just had to find out who he was and why he had this bumper sticker. And it turned out, and tell him that I had a connection to Mineral Wells, Texas, and turned out he's a retired writer for the Buffalo News. He's like in his 70s or something, but for his whole life he was a journalist for the Buffalo News. And he was born, apparently, in Mineral Wells, Texas, but when he was very young, 1 or 2 years old or something, his family moved up here, and he never went back. But his whole life he had wondered about this place where he was born and where he had been baptized in a little Catholic church. And his whole life he wondered, what was it like? What was this place that somehow made an imprint on me as a child? You know, even though he lived in. And finally, when he retired, he just said to his wife, he said, doggone it, we're going. I want to make a trip down there and see this place for myself. It's just really important for me. And so he and his wife went down there, and the Catholic church was closed, but they found a nearby priest who would unlock the building and let them in so he could see his baptismal records, and they saw the area, and he just said it was so meaningful to him. And he wound up coming back and writing an article about his experience, and it was published in the Buffalo News. You can actually still find it online. So we had this wonderful conversation, and then at the end we were just laughing about what a coincidence this was, that he has to probably have the only car in all of Western New York that has a bumper sticker that says Mineral Wells, Texas. And here I was following him down Delaware. And so this incident happened probably 4 or 5 years ago. And just this week, I think it was on Wednesday or Thursday, I was driving down Colvin, and there was his car in front of me again. That Mineral Wells pump. I didn't catch up to him this time, but I thought, oh, there's a sign from the universe, I guess, a message. So pay attention to bumper stickers. But, I thought about his desire to go back and see that tiny little town and understand something about where he had come from was like a burning bush experience for him. The burning bush symbolizes our own burning intuition, some kind of still small voice of wisdom within us that starts to get stronger in that second phase of Moses' development, of our spiritual development, when we've had some mental and intellectual understanding and development, but we're ready for an experience of God. We're ready for the rush of the wind of the Holy Spirit to come, and we just finally get to a point where we have to listen to that voice when it says, go, go make a trip, go connect with this person, go explore, I want to go back and see where I came from. And so that's the kind of story, I think, that's a story worth sharing, or worth keeping and circulating and remembering. And then there's lots of other stories when we got to let it go. There's Totally shares in the book, it's a story that's been around a long time about the 2 Zen monks that were walking along, and they came upon this really muddy road that had been raining really hard, I guess, and there was a young woman standing there in this beautiful silk kimono, and she couldn't get across the road. And the one monk just said, "Here, I'll help you." He picked her up and carried her across the road and dropped her on the other end, set her down, and then the 2 monks continued walking. And they walked for about 5 hours, and finally the one other monk who had not helped the girl just burst out. He just said, "Why did you do that? Why did you pick that girl up and help her cross the road? Don't you know, as monks, we're not supposed to touch women, not to have any physical contact?" And the other monk just said, "Well, I put the girl down hours ago." I let it go. Are you still carrying her? And sometimes we carry our stories like that, that we add meaning to it. And, Tully talks about our stories are not just the story, but the mental and emotional memory. And I would add to it our physical memory, that we carry it in our bodies. Sometimes you have an ache or a pain. It can be, and we carry a large amount of unnecessary baggage, mental, emotional, and so forth. And so we can look beyond. He says you can only go beyond the story. For stories that we do want to release, the discernment is we can only go beyond certain stories, from the lesser to the greater, by taking responsibility for our inner state. To know, and I think it's helpful to know, to separate the facts from the story. Something happened, picking up the girl and helping her across the road, but it's the meaning and all the extra stuff we add to the story, our own projections or attachments, or what other people think, or knowing where do those meanings come from. Well, it may have come from things we've heard from other people, but it comes from inside us that we project onto the situation. And our inner state, as the disciples found in Pentecost, as Moses found, I am. The divine presence is right there in the story, right where we are, because we're there. The presence is a part of us. And then I saw this in the Science of Mind yesterday, remove the glue. And I thought this was a great quote from Emma Curtis Hopkins, who's a New Thought teacher. I think she was the one that ordained Charles and Myrtle Fillmore, our co-founders, when they began on their spiritual path. But she said, all of your affairs, as you look at them, represent your former way of thinking. They're held together by the glue of former ideas. Now, if you withdraw that glue, what can you expect? But that your affairs will fall, will all fall to pieces. To let new affairs emerge, representing a new way of thinking, establishing themselves. So I thought, well, sometimes our state of affairs can feel pretty fragile. Can feel like we're holding it together with maybe popsicle sticks and super glue or something. But the glue is old beliefs, old ideas, old ways of being that can become brittle and hard or inflexible. But Emma Curtis Hopkins is saying, remove the glue. Let all those pieces, let it just kind of fall apart. Let the lesser story go so that a greater story can emerge. And the greater story always involves experiencing the presence of God right there in the moment. And as I thought about it, I think that every prayer request is like that. That whatever is the situation on your heart or mind, concern about for yourself or a loved one or the world, that's a lesser story. And we can be like Moses, or that's what our prayer chaplains help to do, to draw forth a greater story for the purpose of a higher purpose, to set ourselves and others free. So I think maybe we're kind of like Moses. We're being called up for service. And it's our job to say yes. Yes to the presence of God. Yes to the I am that I am. Yes to all those affirmations John opened us with. In today's affirmation, I am a living expression of God. And that's the greater story that we are stepping into. So he says, nothing ever happened in the past that can prevent you from being in the present moment. And that's where we are right now in this present moment. And that's part of our meditation practice is present moment, one moment at a time, to just keep bringing yourself. And it's okay when your mind wanders, or, I've heard people, mindfulness teachers talk about one approach to mindfulness is, imagine it's like walking the dog, and you have to, the dog wanders and you pull it back, the dog wanders, you pull it back a little. Our mind wanders, or we think, go back to the lesser story, oh, how's this going to work out, or, oh, not me, we're like Moses, to the burning bush, you got the wrong person here, I can't do this. But then we keep coming back to the present moment where we find what is true and what is powerful. So I want to leave us with, when we finish, before we go into our meditation, what story are you telling now? What story do you want to tell? What's the truth? We have gathered together, gathering together our spiritual powers. Gathering together, we recognize the spiritual power within each other for the purpose of harvesting the fruits of Spirit. And so, harvesting the fruits of Spirit is knowing the presence of God and knowing that I'm part of that. And, I think Moses had a good thing going for him. He lived at a time before they wrote the song, that's my story and I'm sticking to it, He knew that he could let go. He had to let go of his old story that I can't do it in order to step into a new story, to say, well, maybe I can do it now that I know that it's not me. And that's Jesus, not I, but the Christ within, the Father within that does the work.